listening to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton, because you make good choices in life and are smarter, taller, and better looking than the average podcast listener. It's Thinky Fun Time, you guys, where I bring on a mentat or a thought leader or an author, and we do a show which is more in-depth and focused than the rest of the week, such as yesterday when we discussed whether or not Kim Kardashian would run for president. Today, we're going to talk with Michael Malice. The Fringe is where crazy people live. It's also where geniuses live. New thoughts don't generally originate in the middle of mainstream consensus. That's where seasonal Starbucks drinks come from. Sitcoms with laugh tracks. BuzzFeed listicles about things only 90s kids will know. That stuff comes from the cool kid table, all grown up. Major shifts in paradigms, game changers, and, of course, entire lakes of crackpot ideas. Those are on the outer banks of society. And there's a third group who abodes in that distant twilight as well. Monsters. In addition to savants and cranks, there are truly repugnant individuals who live at the frayed edges of civilization. And you can respond in two ways to that murkiness. You can either ignore it and try and stamp it out, or you can put on your Wellington boots and go see what lurks in the mist. The new right, A Journey to the Fringe of American Politics by Michael Malice, is a plunge into the intellectual shadowlands. I enjoyed it tremendously for two reasons. First, it is always beneficial to learn a new way of thinking, even if you don't ultimately agree with it. Whenever you become fluent in a different worldview, you automatically become smarter, and you see the fault lines in your own beliefs, which were hitherto invisible. Now, I am not an anarchist. Michael is, and his views are inseparable from the prose in his book. To an anarchist, war isn't something categorically different than murder. It's just literal, actual murder on a terrifying, hellish scale. If a gang or corporation did it, we would be shocked. But if they have a flag, well, that's understandable. Now, that's a different mindset to get into, and I think a mindset worth exploring even if you don't wind up living there. The other reason I think the book is important is this. I want to know how monsters think. There's a pervasive mindset at the moment that to give anyone objectionable airtime or even converse with them is to empower and affirm their opinions, and I disagree. If Richard Spencer is truly dangerous, then I would sure like to know his game plan. Michael joined me a couple of months ago to discuss another of his books, Dear Reader, about North Korea. If you're new to the program, however, allow me to introduce you to a fascinating person. Michael and I have been friends for several years. He sometimes describes himself as a troll. I prefer to think of him as impish. Michael loves mischief, but I've never known him to want to hurt people or cause pain. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'll also say that I respect him tremendously as a thinker and a presenter. The media landscape is frankly kind of scary. I find it scary. There are a lot of people out there who want to ruin the lives of anyone they disagree with. Every time I hear Michael on a program, I watch him say exactly what he thinks. He pulls no punches. He does so fearlessly and directly. He's equal parts brain, mirth, and backbone. We will talk to him momentarily. But first, we do have to pay those bills, and that means a word from our sponsor. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by Tornado Repellent from Wunderkim Industries. Tornado Repellent gives you an odor which twisters find entirely unpleasant, warding them off in different directions so that your croquet game out on the back acre is less stressful and windy. You're a young woman named Dorothy, and you live on a farm in Hutchinson, Kansas, along with your adorable dog Toto. One day, as you're walking down the road to your farmhouse, you spot a huge prairie twister lumbering right at you, and it looks hungry. You run into the house as fast as you can. Auntie M, Andy Griffith, do we have any tornado repellent? Why, of course, Dorothy, says Auntie M. It's in the tool cabinet. You fling the tool cabinet open, grab a tornado can repellent, a can of tornado repellent, and dash outside. You spray some on your arms and legs, then squirt some at your mailbox. When the tornado rocks up, it smells that mailbox and rears back revolted and heads west, away from the farm. So instead of Oz, you go to community college. You get a degree in nutrition and marry a returning war veteran named Biff in a modest Methodist ceremony. You serve on the Hutchinson Parent-Teacher Association, start a neighborhood book club, and raise 2 beautiful children. Your marriage isn't always easy, but it's rewarding. Right up until Biff unexpectedly dies from a heart attack while working on his tractor in his mid-50s. So you run the farm yourself for a couple of years and remarry a widower named Mark, who's Catholic, which at the time is quite the gossip in the community. But it doesn't matter. Gossip is gossip. Love is love. And even if they weren't, responsibility is responsibility, and the tax man cometh. So you get by, and you have a long, hard, but fulfilling life. Then one day, in your 80s, you drive to the post office to drop off some mail, and as you do, you accidentally run over a cackling green woman with a conical black hat riding a bicycle. And you think, gee, I wonder who that was. Good thing you had tornado repellent back then, I guess. Tornado repellent is a quick, safe, and non-smelly way to ward off tornadoes and smaller tornadinos from your outdoor family reunion or neighborhood horseshoe tournament. As soon as it gets cloudy and you hear wind that kind of sounds circular, douse yourself with tornado repellent, then sally forth, worry-free. Tornado repellent from Wunderkim Industries. Does it feel windy in here? No, because we use tornado repellent. My guest today is Michael Malice, author of The New Right, and it's delightful to have him back on the program. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Andrew. And I don't have any tornadoes here in Brooklyn anymore, thanks to Wunderkind Tornado Repellent.
That's right.
Wunderkind Tornado Repellent.
Thank you very much. That's a good show plug to have it there. I really enjoyed your new book. It's a thought-provoking and fascinating work. Just to kind of kick us off, can you define the new right for us?
Sure. It's on page 3, and I have a very specific definition. And let me pop up in my copy of my book right here. I define the new right as a loosely connected group of individuals united by their opposition to progressivism, which they perceive to be a thinly veiled fundamentalist religion dedicated to egalitarian principles and intent on totalitarian world domination via globalist hegemony.
Okay. Can you clarify for me the relationship between the new right and the alt-right? Because prior to reading your book, when I think of the new right, I just assume new right refers to young conservatives, whereas the alt-right, I'm thinking of fringe thinkers. But how do you see the relationship?
The new right would be anti-conservative. The new right would be the unorthodox right wing, and a subset of that would be the alt-right, which is focused. The alt-right is the subset of the new right, which focuses primarily or exclusively on race. So the new right has nothing in common other than what they're against, which is progressivism and a specific perception of it.
Yeah, one of the things you do a remarkably a good job with in the book is sort of tracing the intellectual lineage of the new right, which I knew nothing about. And from what I can tell, it's sort of by my lights, unholy alliance between anarchists and populists who normally would not agree on anything, but have kind of forged this anti-progressive consensus that's parts Rothbard and parts Buchanan.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So I do trace it back to that 1992 union between Murray Rothbard, who many people probably haven't heard of, who was a anarchist. They called him Mr. Libertarian during his lifetime, worked with Ron Paul, and Pat Buchanan, who I'm sure more people are familiar with. And between the two of them, you get everything that's encountered in the new right, including trolling, contempt for the establishment, nationalism, protectionism, social conservatism, and also dalliances with people who are, culturally repudiated, for various reasons.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that came up in the book repeatedly that I want to talk to you about is there seems to be a fixation on the Jewish question in new right circles, yes, and certainly in alt-right circles. You yourself are Jewish.
I am.
First of all, how did you feel interacting with people that believe the Jewish question is a legitimate, policy discussion, and why are they so fixated on it?
Well, I was born in the Soviet Union, and I went to yeshiva as a kid, which is, Jewish school. And my dad often told me about what life was like in Russia for Jewish people, and that's one of the big reasons we left. And that was a big reason we were allowed to leave. This was a big kind of agreement between the Soviet Union and the West. So, being a New Yorker, I'm very fortunate that this is not an issue that comes up. And I wasn't actually that disturbed with it, because the people I interacted with, with any movement, you're going to have the people who are stupid, and then you're going to have the people at the top who are very bright. If I sat down, or if you sat down even, with Louis Farrakhan, I doubt that, or Linda Sarsour, I doubt that they would, be contemptuous toward me directly as a person, as opposed to treating me as an individual. So I didn't really have any, pushback. Certain people did not want to talk to me, and I'm fine with that. But others recognize that if I can treat North Korea fairly, I could certainly treat them fairly. And my point, which I make in the book, is I actually look forward to this, because I pointed out the struggle for gay rights wasn't won necessarily by people who are agitators and activists. It was won by uncles, neighbors, coworkers coming out. And it's really hard to have this animosity toward a population when you know even one individual and you just see them even as mediocre. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to hate a group when you're like, I know a guy, he's kind of a jerk, but he's not the devil. So with these types, they even know one Jewish person who's, just okay. It kind of changes the whole kind of dynamic.
All right, so there's a sort of outreach element going on too, where you're not just documenting the thought process of the new right, but also there's a sort of redemptive element going on.
Yeah, and one of the people I interviewed was Chris Cantwell, who was the so-called crying Nazi of Charlottesville, and I was at Charlottesville, and he used to be an anarchist, and then he went down this National Socialist path. And the first question I asked him when we got on the phone is like, "Do you think the world would be a better place if I were killed?" And he's like, "No, of course not." But the fact that he said, "Of course," was kind of very telling. And when I said, "Look, a lot of your followers tell me that the only reason I care about North Korea is because they're anti-Israel," which, I mean, the mental gymnastics there is beyond belief. And he just goes, "What do you want me to tell you? There's dumb people in every movement." So, the thing is that's very important, specifically about these like kind of quote unquote actual Nazi types. The word is used very liberally, but in this case, it would certainly apply.
These are self-identified Nazis.
I'm sorry?
Self-identified Nazis, as opposed to people we have determined to be Nazis.
As opposed to like Mitch McConnell, who, and Mitt Romney, who are called Nazis, right?
Right.
The Nazis in Germany weren't devils. These were human beings. They came home and played with their kids. They murdered during the day or turned the other way when people were oppressed. And then they read books, they laughed, they went to the movies. It would be a lot easier if they were of another species. But they were very, very human, and that's something that is very important, in my view, for people to understand. They're not, because it's very close. It's kind of like Lord of the Flies. It's never that far away.
Well, so focus on that a little bit more for me, because my immediate reaction when you said that, I am literally aware that Nazis are human beings, but there is such a deserved antipathy towards Nazis historically. It was a horrific movement that my immediate visceral reaction was to kind of cock my eyebrows and go, "How dare you humanize these people?" What do you see as the benefit to that? And I assume that it's not coming from a place of apology for Nazism or anything like that, but rather...
No, it's coming from a place that the more you try to pretend these are people who we have nothing in common with, the more naive you are about the possibility of something like it returning or something similar to it returning, and how quickly these things happen. So, I mean, these phenomenon, for Hitler to take power, it wasn't just 10 random people. These were people who otherwise, were perfectly normal. So, and very quickly became radicalized, and very quickly, were looking the other way when children were being, pulled out of attics. So this is something I think people, and the same thing with the South, and slaveholders. I mean, their descendants are here today. The slaves' descendants are here today. These weren't Martians. These weren't people whose thought processes they had brains like you and I have brains. They were wired in a certain way. They believed certain things. So it would be very convenient if we could just say, "Oh, There's nothing like that happening today, and there's people are not. I would never do something like this. The same people nowadays who act in a certain way would have acted in a certain way, you know, if it was 1850.
Well, so noting that, to play devil's advocate, because I think you and I have very similar views on censorship and on trying to obliterate people that we disagree with, but
Sure.
to play devil's advocate for a minute, if people are that similar to some of the most odious individuals in history and are at risk of becoming such individuals, isn't there then a fear that, you know, Nazism could be a contaminant which might activate that group, in which case we should shut them down and not be interacting with them?
Well, I mean, are you an anti-vaxxer?
No, I am not.
Well, there's your answer, huh?
Well,
How do vaccines work? Vaccines expose you to the disease, and then you're immune to it. As opposed to, you know, the current thing where you keep the kids away from, you know, any kind of dirt, and then all of a sudden they're getting all sorts of allergies.
Yeah,
is the current theory.
Yeah, well, and that's like one of the things that was kind of an eye-popping experience for me a couple of years ago was when I started to think about how Richard Spencer views the world. He's a hyper-racial thinker, and that a lot of the very progressive people I know, while they do not share the same values as Richard Spencer, and I'll make that very clear, they're not in the same camp as Richard Spencer, they also have a very racialist worldview of, I should think of myself as a white male. It is a bad thing for me not to think of myself as a white male. And that is what Richard Spencer would like. And so it was one of those things where I was like, I'm glad to know where he's coming from, not because I endorse his position, but because I would like to know how to combat it. And I would rather not be blindsided by it in the future.
Well, I mean, I don't even mention Richard Spencer in the book because I think in many ways he's a media creation. But I'll pivot to something else, which is this. If you saw what has happened, you know, with what the Daily Beast did to that guy who shared a video of Nancy Pelosi, you know, with the audio slowdown, they doxed him. They released his, you know, arrest record, his home address, all this other stuff. So the point I make is, and what the new right would see, it's absolutely true that Nazism is a threat and is dangerous. However, there are people in power right now who would gladly look the other way if you were taken away to a gulag, and they would think it's the right thing to do. So this, I think, is one of the other themes of the book, how the new right regards progressives, a specific type of progressive. The same people who would be perfectly fine if Laura Loomer just vanished from the face of the earth and would applaud. And you see it all the time on Twitter when something bad happens to, let's suppose, Alex Jones or a Milo or something, you know, one of these types. It's the glee, you know, which is all of a sudden Alex Jones is a pariah, as if, you know, he never even talks about race, but now he's supposed to be a Klansman. The glee with which these people are disappeared mirrors exactly the glee with which people were disappeared under totalitarian regimes. It's the same exact phenomenon. So that, I think, is everyone knows, or most people, I think, know that the Nazi menace is bad and Hitler's a bad guy. The new right points out that most people, especially conservatives, are oblivious to just how diabolical the evangelical left is.
It was fascinating to read that, and one of the things that I enjoyed about your book that made me think is that when you're writing it, you've got your own perspective, your own opinions, your own values. The new right has theirs, but you're not attempting to make them cartoonish. You do attempt to really flush out the worldview, and that means being able to pick some pretty intense criticisms of prevalent groups, of moderates, of conservatives, of progressives. First of all, where do you overlap with the new right, if you do, and are you worried about them?
I am worried about whoever's in power as an anarchist. Mm-hmm. They're not in power. The evangelical left is in power. Where I overlap with them is my unremitting contempt for certain people. William F. Buckley certainly gets it really hard in this book, and I explain why
you are not a Buckley fan. Yeah, that comes through.
But whether you're a fan or not, I bring receipts to show why he is one of those monsters that you mentioned at the top of this episode, and is really as repulsive on the inside as he is on the outside. And the reason I feel comfortable being so disparaging of him is some of the examples I used is when prominent people on the right, Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard among them, died. First thing he did was write obituaries in the nastiest, most personal terms possible. At the same time, he affects himself as this kind of arbiter of class and caste. And this is a very left-wing phenomenon where they act like they're the decent, civilized, good people, but the second there's pushback, the mask drops, and the sneering rage and contempt emanates from every pore, which is, in fact, their actual essence.
There's something that I've mentioned in this program several times, which is just me cribbing Thomas Sowell, is there's a difference between viewing someone as being in sin and someone being wrong. Like I can sit down and go, okay, I think such and such is. I wrote an article about John Cleese earlier this week. I think he's wrong about Brexit. I don't think he's evil. Sure. But there is a type of personality that I think has more to do with one having a totalist worldview, that everything has to connect to my specific way of viewing things, which I think is very religious. And on top of that, anyone who is brooking against my totalist worldview must be absolutely snuffed out. There cannot be a contrary opinion to it. This must be the only worldview. And that I find, wherever that crops up, I find it to be a very disturbing element.
That is a very specific type of leftism. And let me explain what I mean by the difference between the evangelical left and someone who happens to be, let's suppose, a liberal, right? Mm-hmm. The question you could ask is there a point at which the costs of fighting racism, homophobia, whatever, outweigh the benefits? Now, most leftists would say, yeah, at a certain point, it's going to be fine. And the example I use is Thanksgiving dinner, right? You have a friend over, he's gay. Grandma doesn't like gay people, and she says some stupid comment. Most people, including most people on the left, roll their eyes. All right, this is an old lady, who cares? If you're an evangelist, and a lot of people get mistaken because they think evangelical means Christian. Evangelical just means the feeling the need to proselytize. Yeah. If you're a member of the evangelical left, you need to sit there at that Thanksgiving dinner and face that sinner and wipe that evil from the face of the earth, and you have to lecture her until she realizes the folly of her ways. These are two very different approaches to an issue, although ostensibly they're both against homophobia. Yeah,
I think it was interesting because you use it again, the term the evangelical left throughout the book. I think that's a good one. I sometimes say the hysterically woke on my own program. We've got a couple of sketches we do where I make fun of. It's not that I'm making fun of progressive viewpoints when I do this character called Michael O'Grimsley. It's that I'm making fun of moral certitude, and I'm making fun of that evangelical, like, you must be stopped for heresy type mindset. Because I grew up with that, watching what was then the religious right. Like in the 80s and 90s, there was the moral majority. And we have to, if a show steps out of line in terms of humor or whatever, we're going to put them in their place. And I think that's kind of migrated because, again, I think it's a more of a pathology than it is a political orientation.
Well, I wouldn't say it migrated. I mean, this is something I disagree with conservatives about, because conservatives have this, and I'm not using this term in a pejorative sense, have this myth that things are bad now, but they used to be good at some golden age in the past. Yeah. And when you ask them when that was, they kind of say the 50s.
1952, really sure. June 4th, 1952, the apex of American history.
Right. And what I would point out is this evangelical left is a direct line to Carrie Nation, who was one of the big saloon busters. She had an axe. She would chop up the saloon. Woodrow Wilson, who explicitly said he was sent by God to save the world. I mean, these were hardcore pro-prohibition people. Hardcore, the idea that, fun and pleasure is something to be suspicious of. And I mean, Woodrow Wilson, people forget about this. He put Eugene V. Debs, the third party candidate for president, in jail for opposing the war, for political speech. It wasn't even like, he's threatening to kill the president. No. He had a political point of view. We should be in World War I.
You said you shouldn't buy war bonds. Threw him in jail.
Yeah. Threw him in jail, and Warren Harding had to be the one to get him out. So this, when conservatives say, oh, they're out of control now. No. They have been in control for 100 years, and you've been oblivious to it because if there's two fish in a river and one fish says to the other, water's pretty warm today, and the second fish says, what's water? Because these people have been framing the discourse in American culture for 100 years, and that's where the term cathedral comes from. People are often oblivious to how pervasive this mindset is, because they think, oh, this is just normal. It's not. It's a mindset.
You know, that's another thing that I really enjoy about the book. You get into kind of the mythology of conservatives and progressives. And again, you're not using it in a disparaging context. You're using it in like a fairly clinical, literary context, what a myth is, that both have origin myths. The conservative origin myth is the founding fathers. The progressive origin myth is the civil rights movement. And that because of that, they both have basically religious connotations as to what is the goal and the mission of a various movement. Like for progressives, you point out that because the civil rights movement is the sort of the foundation of the creation myth, then voting enfranchisement has to be the biggest thing all of the time. And I'd say most of the time I agree with it, but that is nonetheless kind of a religious attitude.
Well, also the idea that, how sometimes conservatives say that the left is obsessed with race. It's like saying conservatives are obsessed with the Constitution. It's the basis of their worldview and the prism through which they view things. So, of course, everything's going to be about race because that is the basis of their thinking. You can't expect anything otherwise. Because the civil rights movement was like a great moral victory for the left, not just legislative. And there's been very little pushback, because how are you going to push back against, the idea of like racism, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what happens is things have momentum, and you hear things like this show on HBO, which just ended, Chernobyl, which was a historical
Wait, did it end?
Miniseries.
I haven't even finished it yet.
Yeah, okay. Spoiler: Chernobyl blows up. Lots of people die.
Okay.
There, you hear things like, why aren't there more minority actors on this show? So the thing is, when there's absolutely no pushback
in 1980s Russia.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's video games taking place in the Middle Ages. Why aren't there people of color here? Mm-hmm. Because again, there's no pushback. You're just going to have that absolute momentum, and then it becomes there have to be black people everywhere. We have to fight segregation, even if that segregation means an all-white cast based on an event in 1980s Russia.
Yeah. And to back up a bit, like I think you do a good job of ripping the rug out from under a variety of myths. Like to go back to conservatives, you bring up the Comstock laws at one point. Like you actually seem like you're a little, there is kind of a clarion call right now within a lot of conservative circles that free speech is under attack, particularly on college campuses, on Twitter and things like that. And I almost got the impression that you thought the attacks on free speech were a little bit overblown, at least in a historical context.
Yes, because I agree. Right, that's a big point I make. People are like, free speech has never been under. First of all, the idea, if there's one thing the Constitution was for, it's protecting political speech. Well, George Washington was still alive when they passed the Alien and Sedition Act. The sedition meaning it was a felony to criticize the government, and people went to jail for this. Journalists went to jail for this. So this is the first thing they went after. The first thing was political speech. No one is going to say with a straight face that pornography was always treated openly and legally in America. So this is a very recent idea. But the more important thing is we used to have 3 networks and maybe PBS, right? Mm-hmm. So you would have entire schools of thought which were rendered invisible. Social media has now made that impossible. You can't really censor schools of thought. And now we're at a point where instead of entire populations being silenced, you can name the people who are being picked off. So to go from silencing hundreds of thousands of people to 50, yes, it's not good for those 50. My point is, in context, this is what technology has allowed, that you have to pick people off on a one-by-one basis. And, of course, other people have to self-censor and so on and so forth. But this is a very big step in the right direction. But there is a lot more work to be done.
Well, yeah, and you bring up the Comstock laws as well, which I think I'd heard of, and I'm sure I read about at one point, but I hadn't realized how quite pervasive they are. That was basically the Postmaster General went, if you use the mail, I can censor it. Like that was more or less the takeaway, was if you put something obscene in the mail, we can arrest you?
And their definition of obscene was, of course, had no objective meaning whatsoever. Moses Harman had a letter he had published in his newspaper from a doctor about a woman who was raped by her husband after childbirth. And the idea, a husband can rape his wife, and you're also discussing such crimes. He was sentenced to hard labor. So, yeah, and as recently as the 50s, Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl was the subject of obscenity laws. So this is not that long ago and not that far away.
So when we get into the new right, we get into the social media scene. You do a lot of talking to the various personalities in the book that are in there. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is you look at trolling as favorable, or at least you talk about it favorably in the book. Are you using it as a, like, walk me through that? Because I do think one of the things that we probably part ways on is I see civility as a good thing, and I think you view civility as a kind of trick to hide things.
There's two types of civility, right? There's the civility of I'm at a dinner party and there's people I don't like there, and I absolutely think it's important to be civil, and not just civil but cordial. Mm-hmm. But civility is often a technique, and this is a very, very leftist analysis, but it's certainly valid. Civility is a technique, a very waspy technique, used by the ruling class to get away with their crap. And you see it nowadays where reporters and politicians are being called on their BS on Twitter, and because they're brazenly lying, and it's like, oh my God, we need to have civility. It's like, no. If you are being so repulsive and such a moral abomination, the idea that it's like, oh, well, I disagree with you, that's not actually the appropriate response.
Okay. So like in the book, I forget the name of the guy, but there's a very genteel racist that you talk to, who's
Jared Taylor.
Yeah, and he's in favor of an ethno-state, and it's. I mean, he's very upfront about this. This is
Sure.
not we're not intuiting this. He's upfront about this, but he seems like he's very polite. So would that be kind of just the same type of thing where he's advocating these very illiberal, I think, bigoted ideas, but he's doing it kindly and therefore able to kind of put a salve on it? Or what was your read of the situation?
Well, no, Jared Taylor, grew up in Japan. He is a very he's like a Bill Buckley of the alt-right, right? But he is, and he actually was asking me because a lot of this incivility in the alt-right he found mind-boggling. And one of my favorite quotes in the book, and I'll never forget this moment, for the rest of my life. He just goes to me. He's like shaking his head because all the Nazi stuff on Twitter. He goes, the idea in this day and age that Hitlerism would be a model for America is simply fantastic. And I go, you mean crazy, right? He goes, oh, yes, thank you for the clarification. Like he couldn't even wrap his head around talking to people with these like Nazi jokes. Like it was so beyond the pale for him. And I don't know that the problem is if you're going to yell at him, you're a racist, you're a racist, you're a racist, that's going to make it seem like you don't have a response to him. So civility is contextual and depends on the person. I mean, if people want to advocate, and let's talk about real incivility. If you want to advocate for a world where politicians have milkshakes thrown on them, Sam Harris had a very, very clever tweet about this, or a bright tweet. I don't want to say clever. He wasn't trying to be cute, where he points out these are mock assassinations. These are demonstrating to the public how easy it is to access these people and get him with a milkshake, and it's not going to be that hard to get him with a knife or a gun. And that is a very profound point.
I agree. And then just to flush this out, you would view that as the wrong kind of incivility?
Yes, I don't think people should be assaulted.
Gotcha. Okay, just making sure. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I definitely I didn't realize, Michael, how waspy I was till I moved to New York. We've had dinner. Turns out I am. So I was curious as to kind of your thinking of that. But it sounds like the takeaway then is that if you're using civility as a mask to lie or do something unconscionable, then you're against it. If you're doing it in a genuine attempt to get along with someone you disagree with, then it's a categorical difference. Yeah.
And also that the fact that the government has all this prestige, but this prestige allows it to engage in really insane behaviors.
And that's something that, like I mentioned at the top of the show, Michael, that I'm not an anarchist, but like I really enjoy talking to you and to Dave Smith because both of you were coming out of that mindset, and there have been these models posited to me where I'm like, that really made me think of things differently. It was either you or Dave, I don't remember which, but kind of brought up that like if the government's just a big corporation, like, would you let it do what it's currently doing? Like, in theory, if we got to vote for whoever was the head of Microsoft, we all got to vote for the president of Microsoft, but Microsoft was then put in charge of the military and polices and schools and all that. Would you be all right with it? It's like, no, of course not. I wouldn't be okay with that at all. And like, well, for some reason we have this sort of sanctifying, almost holdover idea from the Middle Ages. We've sort of transmuted divine right rule into democracy, whereas if democracy works, then a corporate body is now fine. It's been sanctified. It's different than a corporation at that point. And I do enjoy talking to you guys because it gives me this very different perspective on how I look at power.
Yeah, and Chapter 6 is the case. It lays out the case against democracy. But the other point I would make is, in terms of war specifically, I think it's very, very healthy for us to be as skeptical of the president and the government as possible, because we're all taught in school that war is a last resort, and very quickly war becomes the first thing on the table, and the corporate press and their bloodlust for war cannot be overstated. When Trump bombed Syria, he's finally presidential. Right now, during the campaign, the corporate press was saying, do you want Trump with his finger on the nuclear button? He's a lunatic. He's going to start World War III. And now they're like, how is he not fighting with Russia? How is he being diplomatic with North Korea? So they are desperate to get him into a world war conflict. And the more skeptical people are of the president, the less likely they are going to be to accept him sending their sons and daughters overseas to engage in conflict, which at the very least is going to cause people to become widows and orphans. Yeah,
I agree with you on all of those points. I think there's a kind of mystical, quasi-religious element to the presidency. I think it's definitely been built up in our country, but I think that there's just a natural human predilection to kind of hero worship strongmen, and I do not think it's at all healthy. I would I think I brought this up previously, but one of the things I really like about the UK, and it's inadvertent, but it serves well, is that in the same capacity that in the United States, we have made a conscious decision to separate church and state. In the UK, they've just, through accidents of history, separated power and reverence. Because when you go over there, no one respects the prime minister. Like I don't know any Tories that liked Theresa May or liked David Cameron. Like when I was in Scotland and Gordon Brown, who is Scottish, was the prime minister. Everybody was kicking that guy around. Nobody ever said stuff like, I disagree with the prime minister, but I respect the office. No one said that. They respect the Queen, who's toothless and has no power. And I think that's a way better system. I would much rather reverence reside in people that can't kill anybody or can't pass laws than have it kind of cloak bad decisions in this aura of mystique.
Oh, the other thing is, is that prime minister once or twice a week has to get on the floor of the House of Commons and have the opposition leader get up and say, and I'm going to curse a little bit, it's like, Theresa May, you're a stupid. How come your plans are so stupid and you're so incompetent? Have you bought? I remember John Major.
That's basically
being asked,
it. It's just
by the way, have you bought unemployment insurance yet? Because you're going to be out of a job soon. I mean, the nastiest contempt to their face. And I think that feeds into what you're talking about, the idea that this person would be held with reverence when once a week you see them basically being crapped on, almost literally. That is very hard to pull off.
Oh yeah, no, I love the prime minister's questions. I would love it if that were a regular feature of the United States, because it's
on Twitter. Trump is doing it to the opposition. They're just not really doing it to him effectively. Yeah, but that's what he's doing.
Yeah, that is a good point. Yeah, the prime minister's questions. It's like our Senate with the 2-drink minimum and a really nasty disposition. It's fun to watch. I enjoy that tremendously. Which brings us back to trolling. So when I think of trolling, I think of someone as trying to ruin somebody's day, like trying to set them off by triggering them or something like that. But you kind of you clearly have you like Ann Coulter. You talk very favorably about her in the book. Like what do you see as the role of trolling? What do you see as the ethics of trolling?
Well, I mean, in the same way, you talked in the intro that things move from the fringe to the mainstream. Same thing happens with slang. So terms lose their meaning and become, kind of arbitrary. A good example of this in recent history, there's a term that the right came up with called Trump derangement syndrome, which allows people, whatever happens, they're lunatics. Stephen King just tweeted out not that long ago, the horror writer, that, when I'm watching this movie Chernobyl, this miniseries Chernobyl, I can't help but think of Trump. It's like, Trump's presidency is such a disaster that it has had repercussions in the past on another continent. I mean, my God, it transcends space and time.
Yeah.
And that's Trump derangement syndrome. And I've seen people now on the left obliviously using Trump derangement syndrome to mean Trump is so bad he makes me crazy. So it's, you know what I mean? So they've appropriated a term unintentionally. So trolling has now become to mean being a jerk. No.
Yeah.
Trolling has a very specific meaning, which is trolling is forcing, exploiting the person you're engaging with weaknesses in order for them to become an unwitting performer for the sake of the audience or a third party. So it really is about, an example I use with this is Mountain Dew, big corporation selling their poisonous liquid, had a great contest. Hey guys, Mountain Dew, extreme drink. What should our next Mountain Dew flavor be? Vote and like the comments. And the internet's like, oh, okay, we're going to do this. So enough trolls voted that the number one flavor was Hitler did nothing wrong. Now, this was not an endorsement of Nazism. This is like, all right, balls in your court, Mountain Dew. What are you going to do? And they told the poll, they go, all right, I guess the internet won this round. So trolling is, again, forcing someone, especially someone who with a position of power, to force to drop their mask and kind of become performers.
What about like, occasionally I'll hear some story where a group of hackers or whatever finds some, 15-year-old kid in high school and tries to ruin their life or something like that. Is that in a different category than trolling?
That's not trolling, that's bullying.
Okay.
And let me point something else out about how the left works, the evangelical left. You remember, all of your listeners remember, there was that big anti-bullying campaign. Bullying's bad, bullying's bad,
Mm-hmm.
bullying's bad. No, we're not. It gets better. All this other stuff that was more for gay kids. But we have to. There was a big movement about bullying. Then all of a sudden, the left decided to take on the gamers, the people who play video games, and be like, all right, we need to have our ideas in your video games. The gamers fought back, and very quickly, the gamers, who historically are the first ones shoved in a locker, the first ones who were the victims of bullying, all of a sudden now, if you look anywhere in the corporate press, any gamer is regarded as one step away from a school shooter and one step away from white supremacists. They turned on a dime just like that because the gamers stood up to them and refused to bend the knee.
Well, so with trolling, like you mentioned in the book, I don't know if you phrased it exactly this way, but you kind of use it as a litmus test. Like you'll and like as I said, I think that there's a mischievous element to you. Like you enjoy kind of you with a twinkle in your eye, you will say something inappropriate because you just want to see how people around you react. So in your case, if you say something like, that would not normally be considered a mainstream appropriate, 6 p.m. CBS
I'll give you an example from the book.
Yeah.
At one point in the book, I refer to Pat Buchanan. He had worked with Nixon, right? Nixon obviously resigned from the White House. Mm-hmm. And I said, for the rest of his career, the taint of Dick Nixon followed Pat Buchanan around. St. Martin's, I'm sure, we're oblivious to the double entendre there. Mm-hmm. That is a good example of trolling.
Sure. Well, so like my question there is because I think part of it too, you're doing it to react to see how people, how much people are willing to interact with you without putting on platitudes or how entrenched people are in orthodoxy. I think, and you want to see whether they can do it. So noting that. How do you determine when someone is doing something performative or they're trying to get a rise out of someone versus actually being bigoted? Is there a means by which you're able to ascertain this motivation?
Sure. It's how funny they are. So very often people who are, it's true. Very often people who are racist, and everyone listening to this knows what I'm talking about, will throw out a little racist joke, and it's not really that funny, mm-hmm. but they're trying to send out feelers to be like, okay, you're comfortable with this, then they could go all in. So if it's just like, kind of using slurs or something really dumb, that's not trolling and that's not being funny. That is you kind of setting the ground rules and trying to feel out the other person. On the other hand, it's also hard. People play their cards close to their chest. I mean, I guess you can only use your judgment, but I mean, coming from New York, which is, obviously an extremely diverse city, you have friends of all sorts of backgrounds. And everyone's busting each other's balls all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's even, about race, sexuality, gender. So, I don't think it's actually that much of a thin line as people think.
Okay.
I think the body language and mannerisms, it's pretty clear when someone is comfortable around people who are different from them. And it's pretty clear, in my experience at least, when someone's like, oh, all right, I know what you're doing here. I see you.
Okay. Yeah. Going back then
and
to...
I'll give you an example. I'll give you a great example. Chelsea Handler and people like her when she went after Lindsey Graham and people who make all these jokes about Putin and Trump being lovers. The joke's not that funny. This is your homophobia speaking. And don't tell me just because you're for pride, that means you're comfortable with gay people, if the first thing you do is think that gay sex is a punchline for people you hate.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. That was I can kind of weigh in on this as a comedian more than I can as a social analyst. That there are jokes that I look at and I'm like, the context and point of that joke is not racist, even though it has been interpreted as such. What a lot of the time will happen is to really deep dive into this, and I'm sure that you know of a lot of the same people I do, Michael, being in New York. I find that stand-up comedians don't tend to be that easily triggered. I feel improv, there's like a canon of what you can and can't say in improv, regardless of the intentionality behind it. So if in theory I were to do a set and I mentioned the defenestration of Prague and I have a bunch of funny jokes about the defenestration of Prague, which sounds like the kind of thing I would do, and somebody comes up and says, my uncle killed himself by jumping out of a window, I'm wrong by improv rules. I need to apologize, even though I would say, well, I'm very sorry your uncle did that, but I didn't know this wasn't targeted at you. So there are times where you'll say a joke. The point of it is not to hurt or excoriate anybody based on some immutable characteristic like race or gender. However, I have heard other jokes that don't step onto any of those lines that I do think have that intentionality behind them. So an old one, this goes back years and years, but I've heard this in variations several times over the course of my life now, where someone knows they know a nurse at a hospital, or rather a friend of a friend's at a hospital, and they'll have a funny story where a black couple comes in and they go, they're giving birth, and the nurse will say, what do you want to name them? And they'll go, oh, you just said placenta. That's a beautiful word. We'll name her placenta. And I think the point behind that is like, look at these black people trying to be fancy, and they got their comeuppance, didn't they? And I look at that and go, I think the ideology lurking behind that was racist, even though you didn't say anything wrong in terms of specific flashpoints. No
one who's heard that joke laughs.
Yeah.
This is the same thing when leftists are like, whoa, what about Drumpf? And the audience applauds.
About what?
It's like, yeah. What's that?
What about what? I didn't hear the word.
What about Drumpf? Trump's, the original Trump name. And I'll give you a great example that combines trolling and what you're talking about. My favorite comedian, Neil Hamburger, who does anti-humor, he used to come out on stage during the 2000s and say, can we agree that George Bush is the worst president America has ever had? And the audience would erupt in cheers. He would say, which makes it all the stranger that his son, George W. Bush, was in fact the best. And then they don't know what to do. That's trolling.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, and you bring up Andy Kaufman as well, which I liked. I like that you had the Andy Kaufman reference, who's a kind of like, he is sort of a saint of performative comedy, of breaking boundaries.
Oh my, yes. I call him, I would say, the first troll. And a lot of people only know him from Taxi, which is a huge mistake. This guy was, an absolute legend. Still to this day, I think he has a huge amount of cred with most people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, he was definitely, he was shattering all those things. The other cool thing about Andy Kaufman is I don't really get the impression he cared tremendously whether or not the audience found what he was doing funny.
No.
Like it was all the Andy Kaufman show for the benefit of Andy Kaufman. And there's something very, very enchanting about that.
And subversive. He had a special that they refused to air for 2 years. It's on YouTube. And he had a girl from Sound of Music. She was, I don't even know if it was true. That's how he introduced her. Now she's grown up and she's trying to revitalize her career. And he called this segment Has Been Corner. And it was all set like Pee-wee's Playhouse before Pee-wee's Playhouse. Mm-hmm. And she sings the song. He interviews her. And the first thing out of his mouth is like, at what point did you know you weren't going to make it? And you're sitting there. This is 20 years before the office.
Jaw drops.
You want to kill yourself. Yeah. You can't even handle it. You're like, oh my God, please make it stop. And she's like, the stage is my calling. And he goes, well, I don't think you're going to make it, but good luck to you. And you're like, oh my God. And of course she's in on it.
Yeah.
Even knowing that, you still want to die.
Yeah. That's that inducing a cringe. So we're rounding up towards the end of the program. I have a couple more questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
You were at Charlottesville. What was that like? How did you got a memo ahead of time? You decided to go scope it out? Like, tell me about your experiences there.
You've never been? It's the new Milan. I was there. I knew the organizers because I was traveling in these circles. And Andrew, if you remember, I'm the one who when you were working at Fox, I'm the one who told you about this whole scene. We were at the bar called by West 4th, and you had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah, no, I remember that.
The point I make in this book is I knew that this would be a major movement on the right, and every conservative that I discussed this with who were bright people and informed people, they looked at me like I was talking nonsense. And then a few years later, Trump's president, and alt-right is being used to describe Mitt Romney. So because I've been traveling in these circles to some extent and following this movement, that's why I was in a position to write like kind of the definitive book on the subject. I knew that Charlottesville was going to be happening. I was this close to asking to get a speaking gig because I wanted to get in front of all the Nazis and list my favorite contestants from RuPaul's Drag Race in no particular order, because I knew half of them would know what was happening and would find it funny, and the other half would be driven insane, and that's exactly how I like it. There was no rally. There was a march the night before. The rally was canceled, so I was there while all this was going on, and it was very surreal because Charlottesville is a small place. And then when you see it simultaneously on the news as this whole big thing, it was very weird to be like kind of living inside a television in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And were you scared? Were you freaked out? Were you like, what were you feeling while like, the tiki torches were coming out?
Well, the tiki torches were the night before.
Okay.
So we were staying in Virginia, Eastern Virginia. We're driving to Charlottesville in the morning and seeing the tiki torches on CNN. We were like, holy crap. And the outfit I was going to wear, which was these fake leather pants and a T-shirt that said super gay on it, that my friend Bob has. I don't know why he had it, but he had it. I'm like, maybe this isn't a good idea. And I didn't wear my yarmulke either. So the thing that people don't understand, and I would love for one of the Democratic candidates to be asked, do you think that there were bad people on both sides in Charlottesville? Antifa, the streets were packed with Antifa who were looking for a fight. They were desperate to find a Nazi to punch. As we were walking by, my friend Bob had a cowboy hat, the aforementioned super gay one, and one of them just grabbed the hat off his head and played like keep away, just like in high school.
Yeah.
So this is something that doesn't fit into the media narrative, and that's something that's not reported, how much the hard left is aiding and abetting violence towards people that it regards as objectionable.
Yeah, I've always felt rather uncomfortable with the idea that 18-year-old boys can deputize themselves to fight Nazis based on whatever definition of Nazi floats their boat at that exact moment. Because I suspect that when they run out of Nazis, I'm pretty sure when they run out of Nazis that I will become the next best thing if I'm at a college campus, and that there's a good chance I'll get hit in the face with a brick. So I don't like empowering people to be violent on their own terms. In general, I think it's a bad way to go. By
their logic, they're saying it should be okay to walk up to Sarah Sanders or Kellyanne Conway and knock her out. And why not? They're high up in the White House, far more than someone on the street in Charlottesville.
So before we round up, the new right, what are the relative, like what would you estimate are the numbers of people in this? How fringy is it? And then on top of that, there's the actual numbers of the people. What is the impact on it? Because I gather that it is much larger than the actual number of people.
Right. So, I'm not a Democrat in any sense of the word. Numbers, I think, is kind of almost secondary. How many founding fathers were there, right? I mean, how many senators are there? 100. So the numbers, it's very hard to define. And the impact is certainly terribly out of proportion to the numbers, because a lot of this stuff is focused on leftist techniques instead of, a given leftist argument. Instead of being like, let's argue about Obamacare, it's let's affect change in order to make an argument in favor of Obamacare dead before it even starts. So that's kind of, I think, the approach. And I think it's kind of a lot of people are just, in a sense, adjacent to this movement simply because they become so-called red-pilled, which is taken from that documentary, The Matrix. And once you realize that what you're presented as truth in the corporate press is actually a carefully constructed fairy tale, all of a sudden, all sorts of other things fall into place.
Well, okay, and that's the final question I have is, you use, I like the term evangelical left. I think that it's a very descriptive term. I part with you somewhat because I don't view politics as a binary option, and I gather that clearly you've got a very nuanced view of all of this, and you've got different ideologies that you detail in the book. But I do get the impression that you do more or less have a binary that you're operating with. That you're either on the right or you're on the left. I disagree with you on that. Tell me why you tend to favor that terminology.
Because mathematically, there's no place else to go, and I can answer you right now if you're on the right or the left. Do you think? Here's my litmus test. Right. I've said on the Joe Rogan show. Do you think some people are better than others?
Yeah.
Good. A right-winger says yes. A left-winger will give a speech. And this test works 100% of the time. So just like, in terms of gender, even if you don't believe gender is binary and this intersex and gender fluid, there's still two poles. You have to be somewhere on this chart.
See, I don't, but I think you could pick any type of litmus test and then define a spectrum based on that. Like if Tony Blair were with us, he would say that that left and right is defined by openness and closeness to change, whether it be immigration or culture, right? In which case, you and I would be considered left wing, I think, based on his definition.
If who was there?
Tony Blair, if he were here, because
so the fact that the person gave a speech shows that they're on the left.
Well, what I'm saying is I think that you can pick any, if you want to try and create a spectrum with polls, sure. I think you can pick any number of options to do that. But I don't think that there's one that's exhaustive. So
Correct.
I politely reject the premise.
No, you're accepting the premise. You're just saying there's different variants where it applies. You're not going to say left and right means tall versus short, but there are, I'd say, 4 or 5 ways to define left versus right. And in some of them you might be on the left, and in some of them you might be on the right.
Okay, I would accept that. Yes, if there are multiple models that you could be on depending, then sure.
Yes. And I am binary when it comes to politics. I'm an anarchist, so I'm a 0. Everyone else is a 1.
I fully agree with you there, Michael. Because it's funny. Like if you were to put me in a room with a bunch of socialists, then all of a sudden I'm comparatively an anarchist. But if you put me in a room with you, I am now the statist comparatively, because I think there should be a state. So you're definitely like there's a much more clear Platonic ideology there.
You are a socialist. It's just a question of haggling with them.
Yeah, well, I'll save that one for a later date because I think that'll take longer than the remaining 2 or 3 minutes that we have. That said, Michael, I enjoyed having you on. You always make me think. And I appreciate, I really do appreciate how unbowed you are in face of what could be frightening opposition. Because I've listened to you on, obviously my program, but other programs, and I really get the impression that you think very hard, you tell people what you honestly think, and you kind of let the consequences fall as they may. And I think that's admirable in a landscape right now where it's just riddled with landmines.
And I'm just going to quote the Candace Owens of her time, Ayn Rand, where she said, "I'm not brave enough to be a coward."
Great. Michael, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Let's do some listener feedback, shall we? Here's one. Earlier today, I was talking to a lumberjack of a guy named John Bolt of Utah, who's visiting us down here in Texas, and he told me he and his family listen to this program, and he thinks part of it is that I provide a kind of cigars and whiskey proxy for Mormons, which is thrilling. This is the first time in my entire life anyone has ever thought of me as a bad boy, even if those people are Mormons living in a different state who I've never actually met. I'll take it. Andrew Heaton, Disney-level rapscallion, thank you for listening, John and Lance. On YouTube, Linda Myers says, "Dude, you crazy. Funny. Funny. I think I'm both." Also, did you guys know we sell merch? That's right. If you go to shop.theblaze.com, you can buy t-shirts for Jillian's Rooster Removal, the Underwater Bank, Nick's Horseless Diner, Uncle Milton's Caffeinated Crab Dip, Bigfoot for Congress, and, of course, Snuffies. I don't think it makes any major difference to me whether or not you buy the shirt. I want you to do it because you love the show and you want to show that you like the show. And so tweet me a picture of it and it will make my day. You can watch this whole show on YouTube. If you look for Something's Off with Andrew Heaton, you can see my handsome bearded face and assortments of suits and pocket squares and the dead buffalo we screwed to the wall. Watching Something's Off with Andrew Heaton on your computer or phone is guaranteed to provide you with the essential amount of vitamin D. And it can also be applied topically as an essential oil. So go to YouTube and start watching full episodes. I look like the guy who might be on the news later for having attempted to steal Glenn Beck's dog. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out. Finally, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage. Thank you, and good day.